She treated me like a servant in my own home for 3 months, and I let her because guilt has a way of making you small. But when she yanked open my freezer that Tuesday afternoon searching for ice cream, everything I'd been hiding came crashing down, and the secret I'd buried there changed both our lives forever. If this story gives you chills, hit that subscribe button, because USA Diary brings you the most shocking true stories that prove reality is stranger than any fiction. ***. # My daughter was bossing me around in my own house. But when she opened the freezer, I never thought I'd become invisible in my own home, but that's exactly what happened when my daughter Rebecca moved back in after her divorce, and at first I told myself it was temporary, that she was hurting, that she needed her mother, and I could be strong for her, but 3 months turned into a different kind of prison, where I wasn't Margaret Sullivan, the woman who'd raised 2 children alone after my husband died, where I wasn't the retired nurse who delivered hundreds of babies into this world, where I wasn't even a person with needs or feelings or a voice that mattered, because Rebecca had decided that her pain was the only pain that existed in our house, and every morning started the same way, with her standing in my bedroom doorway at 6:30, telling me she needed her coffee made a certain way with oat milk, heated to exactly 140 degrees, and I dragged myself out of bed even though my arthritis screamed in protest, even though I worked a double shift at the hospice center the day before, because saying no to your own child feels like swallowing glass, especially when you remember the little girl who used to crawl into your lap during thunderstorms and tell you that you were her whole world. But this wasn't that little girl anymore. This was a 34-year-old woman who somehow decided that her mother existed solely to serve her, and the commands kept coming all day long, like I was some kind of employee. She could bark orders at wash these dishes a different way, fold the towels the right way, for once stop making noise when I'm on a call with my therapist, pick up my dry cleaning before they close, get the grocery shopping done, but only buy organic, and don't you dare come home with the wrong brand of yogurt again. And I took it all without complaint, because mothers are trained from birth to absorb their children's suffering to make themselves smaller so their children can be bigger, to swallow their own needs until they forget they ever had any. And my friends noticed it when they called asking why I couldn't meet them for lunch anymore, why I stopped going to my book club, why my voice sounded hollow and defeated when I made excuses about being busy. But how could I explain that I was trapped not by locks or chains, but by the terrible weight of maternal guilt, because Rebecca's marriage had fallen apart, and somehow in the twisted logic of family pain, that meant I owed her something. I owed her my time, my energy, my entire existence, as payment for what exactly I didn't know, maybe for not being able to prevent her pain, maybe for not teaching her how to choose better men, maybe for the crime of being her mother, and therefore responsible for everything wrong in her life. And then came that Tuesday afternoon in late October, when the leaves outside were dying in brilliant shades of red and gold, and I'd just come home from the grocery store with 6 bags of organic, everything, my arms aching, my back screaming. And Rebecca was pacing in the kitchen on another call with her lawyer, and she snapped her fingers at me, actually snapped her fingers like I was a dog, and pointed to the bags like I should have known telepathically that she wanted them unpacked immediately, even though I could barely feel my hands anymore. And I started putting things away in silence, the way I learned to move through my own house like a ghost, trying not to disturb the living. And then she said it, the thing that finally cracked something inside me. She said, "Mom, I need you to stop sighing so dramatically. I'm trying to concentrate, and I am tired of your martyr routine." And something in those words hit me like a physical blow, because I wasn't sighing dramatically. I was just breathing, just existing in my own space. And the martyr routine comment, that was rich, coming from someone who spent 3 months treating me like hired help while playing the victim of her own bad choices. And I felt something sharp and hot rise in my chest, something that tasted like anger mixed with 3 months of swallowed words. And I opened my mouth to finally say something, to finally stand up for myself, when Rebecca walked over to the refrigerator, still talking on her phone, still not looking at me, and yanked open the freezer door, saying something about needing ice cream to cope with her stress. And that's when time seemed to stop, because I'd forgotten what was in there. I'd gotten so used to the weight of my secret that I stopped thinking about it, stopped checking on it. And now Rebecca was staring into the freezer, and her face was changing, going from irritation to confusion to something else, something I couldn't quite read, and her phone slipped from her hand and clattered on the floor. And she turned to look at me with eyes so wide they looked like they might fall out of her head, and she whispered, "What is this?" And I felt my legs go weak, because I knew I couldn't hide it anymore, couldn't pretend. And I said in a voice that didn't sound like mine, "It's $60,000 in cash, Rebecca." And she just stared at me, and then back at the freezer, where I wrapped the money in layers of plastic and foil and hidden it behind bags of frozen vegetables and old containers of ice cream. And for a long moment neither of us moved, neither of us breathed, and then she said, "Why do you have $60,000 hidden in your freezer?" And I could hear the fear in her voice, the confusion, and I realized she thought maybe I'd done something illegal, maybe I'd stolen it, maybe her mother had become someone she didn't know. And I sat down at the kitchen table because I couldn't stand anymore. And I said, "I need to tell you something. I need to tell you about your father." And Rebecca's face went pale because we never talked about him, never spoke his name in this house because he died when she was only 7 years old, and for 27 years D kept his memory clean and perfect for her and her brother, the way you do for children who lose a parent too young. You turn them into saints, you erase their flaws, you protect the fantasy, because isn't that what love is? And I said, "Your father didn't die the way I told you he didn't have a heart attack at work." And Rebecca sat down across from me, moving like someone in a dream, and she said, "What are you talking about?" And I felt 27 years of lies rising in my throat, threatening to choke me, and I said, "He killed himself. Rebecca, he killed himself because he embezzled money from his company and he was about to get caught and he couldn't face the shame, couldn't face prison, couldn't face what it would do to us, and so he took pills in a hotel room and left me a note, and in that note he told me where he'd hidden the money he stolen, thinking he could somehow make our lives better. And the note said, "Please forgive me, please use this to take care of our children. And don't let them know what I did, don't let them hate me." And I'd kept that secret for 27 years. Hidden that money and lived like we were poor because I was too afraid to use it, too afraid someone would ask questions, too afraid the company would come looking, and I'd raised 2 children on a nurse's salary, working double shifts and night shifts and holiday shifts while $60,000 sat in my freezer like a bomb waiting to explode. And Rebecca was crying now, tears streaming down her face. And she said, all this time we struggled and you had money." And I said, "I couldn't touch it, don't you understand? I couldn't use blood money, I couldn't benefit from what your father did. But I also couldn't turn it in because then everyone would know, then you'd know." And I promised him in my heart, I'd promised to protect his memory, to let you keep your father, even if I had to lose myself in the process. And Rebecca's face crumpled and she said, "You let us believe he was a hero, you let us believe he died with honor." And I said, "He did die with honor in the only way he knew how. He died protecting you from the truth, and maybe I was wrong, maybe I should have told you. But you were 7 years old, Rebecca, you were 7 and your brother was 9, and how do you tell children that young that their father was a thief and a coward and that he chose death over facing the consequences of his actions?" And Rebecca stood up and paced the kitchen and she said, "I don't know who you are, I don't know who he was, I don't know anything anymore." And I felt my heart breaking because I'd known this moment would come eventually. I'd known that secrets this big can't stay buried forever. They grow teeth, they claw their way to the surface. And I said, I'm still the same person who sat with you through every nightmare, who taught you to read, who held your hand on the first day of school." And Rebecca whirled around and shouted, "But you lied about everything." And I said, "Yes, I lied to protect you, and maybe that was wrong, maybe I should have been honest, but I was 29 years old and suddenly a widow with 2 small children and a dead husband's crimes on my shoulders, and I did the best I could with an impossible situation." And Rebecca sank back into her chair and put her head in her hands, and for a long time we just sat there in the silence of my small kitchen with the freezer door still open, with the secret finally exposed like an open wound. And then Rebecca said in a small voice, "Why are you telling me this now?" And I looked at her, really looked at her, and I said, "Because I am dying, Rebecca. I have stage 4 pancreatic cancer. And the doctors gave me 6 months, maybe less, and I found out 2 weeks before you moved back in, and I didn't tell you because you were already falling apart because of your divorce, and I thought I could carry this alone the way I've carried everything else alone, but I can't anymore. I don't have the strength, and the reason I let you boss me around, the reason I've let you treat me like I don't matter, is because I've been trying to give you whatever you need before I'm gone. I've been trying to be whatever you need me to be, even if that means being your punching bag. But I can't do it anymore, Rebecca. I can't keep swallowing myself. I can't keep pretending that my life doesn't matter just because it's ending." And Rebecca's face had gone from pale to gray and she was shaking, and she said, "What?" And I said, "I'm dying, sweetheart, and I'm sorry I didn't tell you sooner, but I was trying to protect you again the way I always have, and maybe that's my fatal flaw. Maybe I protected you too much. Maybe I should have let you see that life is complicated and messy, and sometimes the people we love make terrible choices, and sometimes we make terrible choices trying to clean up their messes." And Rebecca stood up and came around the table and she wrapped her arms around me and she was sobbing into my shoulder saying, "I'm sorry, I'm so sorry, Mom. I've been such a horrible person. I've been so cruel." And I held her the way I'd held her 1,000 times before, and I said, "You not horrible, you're hurt, and hurt people, and I've been hurt for 27 years carrying your father's secret, and maybe I hurt you by lying, maybe I hurt you by hiding the truth, but everything I did out of love, even when love meant making the wrong choice." And we stayed like that for a long time, crying together, and then Rebecca pulled back and wiped her eyes and said, "What do we do with the money?" And I said, "I don't know. I've been asking myself that for 27 years." And Rebecca looked at the freezer and then back at me and she said, "The company he stole from, did they go under?" And I said, "No, they survived. They still operating." And Rebecca nodded slowly and said, "Then we give it back. We find a way to return it anonymously and we let this be over." And I felt something loosen in my chest, something that had been clenched tight for decades, and I said, "Are you sure?" And Rebecca said, "Yes, because keeping it hasn't done anything but poison us, and maybe returning it won't undo what Dad did, but it's a start." And I nodded, and then I said, "There's something else I need to tell you." And Rebecca laughed a wet, broken laugh and said, "How can there possibly be more?" And I said, "The money, that's not the only thing in the freezer." And Rebecca's eyes went wide again and she walked back to the freezer and started moving things around, and then she found the small wooden box hidden in the very back, and she pulled it out and opened it, and inside was another letter from my husband and a small envelope with Rebecca's name on it. And she looked at me with questions in her eyes, and I said, "He wrote you a letter too. He wrote one for you and one for your brother, and I've kept them all these years because I didn't know when the right time would be to give them to you, and maybe there is no right time, but I think now is the time. I think you need to hear from him," in his own words. And Rebecca took the letter with trembling hands and she sat down and she opened it and she read, and I watched her face change as she read, as she heard her father's voice after 27 years of silence. And when she finished, she was crying again, but differently, softer. And she said, "He says he loves me. He says he's sorry. He says he made mistakes, but that I should learn from them, that I should be braver than he was." And I felt tears streaming down my own face, and I said, "He did love you, Rebecca. He loved you more than anything, and that's why he couldn't face you after what he'd done, and that's why he made the choice he made." And Rebecca said, "It doesn't make it right." And I said, "No, it doesn't. Nothing makes it right, but maybe we can forgive him anyway. Maybe we can forgive each other." And Rebecca reached across the table and took my hand and she said, "How long did they give you?" And I said, 6 months, maybe less. And she said, "Then we're not wasting any more time. We're not spending your last months with me treating you like you don't matter. We're going to do this right." And I said, "Do what right?" And she said, "Everything. We're going to talk. We're going to be honest. We're going to return the money. We're going to visit your brother with his letter. We're going to make the most of whatever time we have." And I felt something I hadn't felt in months, maybe years. I felt hope, small and fragile but real. And I said, "Okay." And Rebecca said, "And Mom?" And I said, "Yes." And she said, "Thank you for protecting me even when it cost you everything." And I said, "That's what mothers do, sweetheart. We protect our children even from the truth, especially from the truth." And we sat there in my kitchen with the freezer still open, with the secret finally free, with the future uncertain but somehow lighter. And I realized that sometimes the worst thing that can happen is also the best thing, because if Rebecca hadn't opened that freezer, if she hadn't found the money, we might have wasted my last months trapped in our old patterns, trapped in resentment and silence. But now we had a chance to do it differently, to be honest, to be real, to love each other with all our flaws and failures exposed. And that night we took the money out of the freezer, all of it, and we counted it, and we made a plan to return it anonymously to the company my husband had stolen from. And then we called Rebecca's brother David and we told him everything, and he flew in the next day, and we gave him his letter from his father, and we all cried together, and we all talked for hours about the father we thought we knew and the father we were learning about now, and about forgiveness and truth and the complicated nature of love. And in the months that followed, Rebecca moved back into her own apartment, but she came to visit every day, and we did things we never done before. We went to the ocean and we had long dinners, and we really talked about our lives and our fears and our regrets. And I told her stories about her father, the real stories, not the sanitized versions, and she told me about her marriage and why it had failed, and we were honest with each other in a way we'd never been before. And we returned the money anonymously through a lawyer, and I felt a weight lift that I'd carried for so long. I'd forgotten it was there. And when I finally died, it wasn't in a hospital bed. It was at home with Rebecca and David on either side of me, and my last words were, "I love you both, and I'm sorry I wasn't perfect." And Rebecca said, "You were perfect enough, Mom, you were perfect enough." And I closed my eyes, knowing that the truth had finally set us all free, that the secret in the freezer had been the catalyst we needed to find our way back to each other. And that sometimes the things we hide in the dark are the very things that, when brought to light, can save us.